Like pieces on a chessboard, one of the key aspects of combat in Final Fantasy is knowing how to best utilize the units at your disposal. In some games, like Final Fantasy IV, VI and 9, roles were pre-assigned, but other entries took a different approach, allowing players to assign their own roles. Some of these, such as the Black Mage or the Dragoon, have become famed due to a combination of their in-game application and associated characters, but others have been more underwhelming, sometimes relegated to the dustbin of the franchise as a result. And it's those jobs specifically that we're going to be covering in this video. The ones that weren't quite as good as they could have been, to the point of being almost completely useless. As always, we'll only be featuring one job per entry in the franchise, so without further ado, let's get things started with everyone's favourite coward, as we talk about the Bard from Final Fantasy IV. Final Fantasy IV had unique characters, and each was assigned a job that worked in with their narrative arc. Cecil, for example, had a story about redemption, and this saw his transition from a Dark Knight through to a Paladin serving as a major story beat. Rydia, on the other hand, was raised in the Village of Mist, the Summoners, and as her role in the story grew, so too did her proficiency with the art of summoning. Edward, the Prince of Damcian, was known for two things: being a musician and being a coward. These two aspects then worked well with his in-game application, as his job was Bard and he had a unique ability. Edward's main command was Bard Song, but this served as a downgrade on utility compared to Final Fantasy III. Instead of providing significant buffs, it meant Edward could only try and inflict negative status effects on enemies. He also had terrible stats while he was in the party, a fact made more clear by that unique ability, which was Hide. This let Edward remove himself from battle, and it was even used automatically if his health got too low. As such, Edward wasn't really a party member that could be relied on in a pinch, as he often opted to stay out of things if they got too hairy. Though this was all intended as a way of capturing Edward's characterization while in battle, it had the side effect of making him a little bit of a deadweight. Surprisingly though, if one was to level him up to level 70, his stat gains all of a sudden became astronomical, making him, paradoxically, one of the best characters in the game, at least from a numbers perspective. But as very few would have ever taken the time to actually level him up that high, this feature of Edward's remains a bit of a cheeky secret, and didn't do much to save him from a place on this list. Blue magic in Final Fantasy games has always been an intriguing and entertaining option, as instead of casting classic spells, it has enabled players to wield enemy abilities. But this potential has always been balanced out by the methods used to obtain said abilities. In some instances, for example, the only way to learn abilities was by having enemies use them on a blue mage. That then made the Beastmaster an intriguing prospect when it was introduced in Final Fantasy V, as you could control enemies instead and make them act as allies, or even turn them on your blue mages to learn missing abilities. Due to its niche application, the use of Beastmaster after Final Fantasy V was limited. But in the early 2000s, there was a resurgence through Final Fantasy XI and then Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. In the latter game, Beastmaster was exclusive to the Numu race, and it featured a variety of abilities capable of controlling monsters when in battle. But its use was quite limited, as players lost control of a monster when it was their turn again. It meant one of the main applications was actually forcing monsters to use their best abilities on any present blue mages. One other use was buffing character stats, as Numu jobs were largely focused on the magical art. Assigning one as a Beastmaster offered them improved physical stats over most of the other options. That being said, even the results here were underwhelming, especially when compared to the jobs available to other races. It meant Beastmasters in Tactics Advance were simply ill-suited for combat. In line with its tabletop roots, the original Final Fantasy let players pick each of their party members' roles at the beginning of the game, and they were able to choose from 6 different jobs. Each of them brought unique things to the table, and there were clear strengths and weaknesses. For example, the monk excelled at physical combat, whereas the white mage excelled at healing and buffing the party. But not all jobs were created equal, and therefore one of the 6 available roles was bound to be a little less useful than the others. For the first part of the game, the role that lagged behind was unequivocally the thief, as its stats left a lot to be desired when compared to the warrior or the monk. However, this all changed after completing the Citadel of Trials, as this was when all the jobs received an upgrade, changing them into something completely different. And the most disappointing upgrade saw red mages transformed into red wizards. Serving as a direct contrast to the thief, which, while starting off underwhelming, became amazing when upgraded to the ninja. The red mage was pretty powerful and useful in the early game, but became far less desirable in the late game. As a jack of all trades, but master of none, the red wizard had middling physical stats, and it was unable to access the same levels of powerful magic afforded to black and white wizards. Therefore, the red wizard, despite getting off to a strong start, ended up being rather disappointing by the end of the game, as either dedicated damage-dealing jobs or those with access to higher level magic proved far more useful at tackling the game's later challenges. Though the various remakes and remasters have attempted to even things out, this just served as evidence that in the original Famicom version, it was a job that fell short of its peers. Final Fantasy II looked to change what the original Final Fantasy had brought to the table by allowing players to craft their own jobs. It was a novel concept, but it didn't quite pan out as intended. As such, for Final Fantasy III, Square went back to the drawing board and revamped the job system from scratch. This new system allowed players to switch between set jobs when desired, albeit with a temporary penalty, and it featured way more options than the original game, allowing for more diversity with party setups. Effort was therefore placed on making sure each role felt unique, but sometimes that went a bit too far, despite good intentions, and the Scholar stands as the perfect example of this notion. It was intended to give players the upper hand on their enemies by revealing their weaknesses and remaining HP. While in theory this was useful against some bosses like Hein, most of the time it simply wasn't worth dedicating a whole character to. It was perhaps for this reason that later re-releases and remasters sought to address the issue, overhauling the Scholar to give them abilities such as item lore and alchemy. The jobs that specialise in one thing, and then do that one thing really well, can certainly make a case for their utilisation. Sometimes a job can be a little too good at its role, and as a result, see its utility diminished. A prime example of this is the Berserker in Final Fantasy V. Featuring high strength and stamina stat boosts, alongside the ability to equip all the most powerful weapons such as axes and hammers, the Berserker on paper seemed like an ideal choice for a dedicated physical unit. But that was until Auto Berserk was factored in. This passive ability granted the Berserk status from the start of a battle, and while it meant Berserkers did gain a considerable stat boost to their already impressive physical attributes, the downside was that this stated rendered them completely uncontrollable. It meant the Berserker was a bit of a one-trick pony, as they would just continue to attack enemies relentlessly until either the battle was over or they had fallen themselves. There was an upside though. Perhaps due to the limited utility, Berserker required a very low amount of AP to master, so it could then be used to boost the stats of other jobs. But beyond that, its usage is limited beyond challenge runs, or just general curiosity. Though the original release of Final Fantasy XII allowed players to develop characters in any way they wanted through the use of the license board, when the game was updated to the International Zodiac job system, Hiroyuki Ito sought to change this fundamental aspect, as he felt players had not used the system in good faith. Instead of exploring different options, he noticed that players often just crafted a party of identical super soldiers, and as a gameplay and systems connoisseur, he was immensely frustrated. Therefore, 12 jobs were created for this new version of the game, and each one was associated with a zodiac sign. Amongst the list were classics such as the Knight and the Black Mage, but there were also some new roles included too, and one of these, the Foebreaker, was unfortunately also one of the more perplexing. On the surface, the Foebreaker was a job with a lot of utility, and some promising stats that made it a formidable tank. It allowed players to utilise powerful equipment such as axes, hammers and hand bombs, as well as granting access to its ultimate weapon, Vrasika, earlier in the game than most other jobs. But all of this came at the cost of its damage-dealing capabilities being based on an unreliable formula. This formula added a considerable amount of randomness to the Foebreaker's damage output, which was exacerbated by the fact that the weapons it had access to also had less than ideal combo rates. Though both high damage output and tanking heavy hits were possibilities with the Foebreaker, unfortunately, there were simply more reliable or better ways to do both with other jobs. In the Zodiac Age version of the game, Foebreaker was able to find new life as a second job, potentially adding a lot of beneficial stat gains, abilities, and weapons to a primary job. But as a first choice, there was unfortunately little reason to use it, unless you're just a fan of gambling on damage output. That then brings us onto our final entry, which comes from the original Final Fantasy Tactics. With a dynamic, isometric combat setting, mobility and range became important considerations, and it meant the archer seemed like a valuable job. This notion was enforced by some early encounters, such as those in the Door to Slums, where the job was employed successfully by the enemy, and many were sold on their lethality as a result. In practice, though, things were quite different. Though archers could deal damage at a distance, actually doing so was often more difficult than felt necessary. This was because archers needed both elevation and distance to do what they did best. So to use the role to its maximum potential, an archer required access to the highest ground available, while maintaining a solid distance from the intended target. The other quirk was that the archer's main damage ability, Aim, was too slow to be an effective tool, despite the damage it could deliver. Without using immobilizing statuses to keep the target in place, this meant Aim could miss its mark should the target simply move, rendering the damage boost it provided irrelevant. As such, offensively, archers and their offensive abilities didn't scale well into the late game, let alone the optional challenge area, Midlight Steep. To their credit, archers did have access to a handful of useful reaction and support abilities, but for the most part, it was a job that existed as a stepping stone to better jobs like Ninja, rather than being a long-term solution to ranged combat scenarios. But with that, they were 7 jobs that ended up being almost completely useless. Be sure to share in the comments below which jobs you've also felt were quite useless, and if you enjoyed the video, feel free to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, Chris M. Walker, Christopher Gardner, Clever Chavez, EXP Required on YouTube, Gregory and Stephen, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.